Welcome to the July 14th, 2021 REACH 3030. It's Bastille Day in Europe. And so I don't know if you were on the task of 3030, but we talked about, sort of reporting requirements that are now pressing. Here we're going to talk about things that are coming up in the future in Europe that may impact you significantly if you ship polymers into Europe. We're going to talk about the registration of monomers and polymers, which of course has already been in effect since REACH entered into force in 2007. But there have been some new European Chemical Agency Board of Appeal cases involving monomers and polymers, which are quite important. But we're also going to talk about the proposed registration of polymers requiring registration. Next slide, please. So I'm Herbert Stryker, and I've given all of these. Next slide, please. I'm joined today by my colleague, Alesh Bartel, who has been co-presenter on all of these since he joined our firm in April of 2020. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on with respect to proposed plans to require registration of certain polymers in Europe. As you know, right now, polymers exempt from registration. Instead, the monomers in the polymers, they're bound to polymers, are subject to registration. So then there are now plans, very concrete plans, to establish a registration regime for the polymers themselves. They're very concrete. This is definitely going to happen. It'll probably take 2 years or so before it actually happens, 2 or 3 years. But it's definitely going to happen. Next slide, please. So, and I've reported on this issue in the past on REACH 3030s a couple of times, but there are a lot of developments, and I thought people would be interested in to know where everyone's thinking is now. So there is a subgroup of experts from the EU member states. It's called the Casg Polymer Subgroup. And they're working on developing a proposal for the registration of polymers, and they're focusing on the following issues: which types of or classes of polymers merit registration, what should be the information requirements. There needs to be an impact assessment, which is now planned for the end of 2022, and they're working on how that impact assessment will look. And of course, they're mindful of the fact that there's an overall objective under REACH to minimize vertebrate animal testing, where possible. And they're mindful of the fact that a lot of the in vitro assays and QSAR simply don't work for polymers. So that presents very special challenges. Next slide, please. So I've talked about this before, but there were a number of consultant reports that the Commission, European Commission, authorized. The last one was by a group called Wood Consultancy, and what they proposed to do is they proposed to divide the universe of polymers into basically 3 main categories. There would be things that were polymers of low concern, which would not be subject to registration. There would be certain polymers that did not qualify as polymers of low concern, but for other reasons would still not be subject to registration. And then the third category in purple here would be polymers that require registration. And there'd be 3 types based on molecular weight. Type 1 would be less than 1,000 Daltons, small polymers. And they propose that the registration data for the small polymers be the same as any substance. Type 2 were intermediate molecular weight, and they propose that there be reduced testing for that category of polymers. The third were high molecular weight, above 10,000 Daltons, and they proposed that there only be data requirements if they had certain features, such as they were cationic, or they had reactive functional groups, or surface active polymers, etc. Well, that still provides somewhat of a framework for what's going on now, but this whole thing is being pretty much rejected, and European authorities are moving to a much more expansive requirement to register polymers in Europe. Next slide, please. Now, you probably can't see the slide. We put all our slides and a recording of the presentations on our website. You can access that by punching into Google reach 30 backslash 30. But basically, the way this would work is one really sort of would basically be subject to registration unless you were a polymer of low concern, pretty much. And there'd be very few exceptions. If you were not a polymer of low concern, you would be subject to registration. And I'll put this up and you'll see how they're looking at it. If it was surface active, if it degraded into substance of concern, if it had reactive functional groups, if it was any of the 12 main classes of polymers that are considered problematic. So basically, it'd be very hard to fall out of the polymer registration obligation if you are not a polymer of low concern. Next slide, please. So the Commission has put up a proposal for what should be a polymer of low concern in the EU. That's a new concept for the EU. Obviously, we've had that concept around the world for many, many years. I mean, there's a TSCA polymer exemption. The Canadians have reduced risk polymers. The Japanese have polymers of low concern. The Australians have a criteria for polymers of low concern, and so the Koreans. So, but it'll be a new concept in Europe, and so the Commission sort of developed a proposal for that, which is not that much different than what's done elsewhere, but I'll point out some differences. So the polyester list, we're aware of the TSCA polymer exemption. You don't have to register a polymer or a new polymer if it is comprised of things on a polymer list. Well, the European Commission's proposed to use the same list, although there are some monomers that will fall off, which the Canadian experts have advised the Europeans to drop from the list. But remember, when we talk about registration of polymers in Europe, we're not just talking about registration of new polymers, which is very common around the world. We're talking about registration of both new and existing polymers, which would make it almost unique. The only other country that requires registration of the existing polymers right now is Korea, although this will be required in, the only thing required right now is Korea. There will be molecular weight criterion, as you know, let's say for TSCA polymer exemption, has a molecular weight criteria and a ligand content criteria, depending on whether you're between 1,000 and 10,000 Daltons or you're over 10,000 Daltons. So the Europeans would use the same criteria as the US, except perfluorinated polymers with a number average molecular weight of less than 1,500 Daltons could not qualify as a PLC, polymer of low concern. Next slide, please. Some differences between how one would treat the reactive functional groups. And I'll leave that the technical details for you, but it's not quite the same as the US system, how reactive functional groups are used. It's more conservative in the Commission's proposal. In the same way that the TSCA polymer exemption excludes high molecular weight polymers that are capable of absorbing their weight in water, what they call the high water absorption capacity polymers. That would apply in Europe as well, except that there would be a requirement that the particle size be less than 10 microns or inhalable, which is not a requirement in the US. So here, to some extent, it's a little bit more flexible than it is in the US. Next slide. I'll leave this to you for your homework as well. But I think the good news is that, in the TSCA polymer exemption, if a polymer is designed, it can be expected to degrade, it doesn't qualify for the exemption. But in Europe, it would qualify as long as it doesn't degrade into a hazardous substance. So that's good news. But I'll leave this for you to study. Next slide, please. So the Wood Consultancy, which I already mentioned, estimated that there would be some 33,000 polymers and 11,000 groups of polymers that would require registration under this proposal, which is obviously a huge number of polymers. So the authorities have been working, particularly with industry input, CEFIC and others, on trying to come up with strategies for grouping polymers. And the European Chemical Agency has come up with what they call a thought starter on this topic, as to which polymers could be jointly registered as one substance, which they're calling a PRR, or Polymers Requiring Registration Substance. So a couple of things they're thinking of. They're saying, well, if the polymer falls in into different molecular weight ranges, and I mentioned there are 3 of them, less than 1,000 Daltons, 10,000 Daltons, greater than 10,000 Daltons, they could all be registered as one substance, which is helpful. I mean, otherwise you'd have more than 33,000 polymers. You'd probably have 1 billion polymers. So they couldn't decide that. But they said that, that there may be different data required depending on molecular weight distribution, and that would have to be dealt with using the adaptations under Annex 11 of REACH. What do they mean by that? Well, so for example, high molecular weight polymers presumably are not bioavailable. You might be able to waive some data requirements on that basis, things of that nature. Next slide, please. So they also, the European Chemical Agency also proposes to adopt a 2% rule, which is very common around the world. So if you have a polymer and it would not have to be registered again if it had another version or a variant which had less than 2% of another monomer in it. So it's very similar to 2% rule around the world. I think that's pretty good news that they've agreed to adopt that in Europe, although it's not surprising. And they said that the ratio of the reactants, or the monomers, could vary. The impurity profile could vary. The molecular weight could vary, and the monitor ordering tacticity could vary. So, but otherwise, pretty much each polymer would have to be registered in its own right. Next slide, please. There may be things that influence and cause one to distinguish between a polymer with the same Cas number. And so, for example, the manufacturing conditions, whether it's linear or branched, whether it's alternating or random or block copolymers, the tacticity and the end groups could cause a polymer that is still on the same Cas number because there's a different polymer in Europe that require separate registration. Next slide, please. The European Chemical Agency is also discussing polymer nomenclature. They're proposing that polymers be named in the same way as UVCB substances, so it would not be the standard Cas monomer-based nomenclature, or even the IUPAC nomenclature. There'd be a special nomenclature for REACH, and so it would look at the things like the polymer type, specification of backbone type, the type of monomer sequence of the polymer, random, alternating, block, may need to be specified in the name. The 2% rule would be maintained for naming purposes. The distribution of molecular weights and corresponding polydispersivity would have to be part of the name, and the structures, constituents of the polymer would have to be part of the name. So that would not only be the monomer units, but the reactants, the backbone type, the sequence type, and the terminal types. So really, groups are really thinking of very, very specific names for these polymers. At least that's what the European Chemical Agency is thinking about. Next slide, please. So where are the member states on this? Well, they pretty much think it's great. France wants require companies to notify all polymers. So there'll be an initial notification where you notify the European Chemical Agency that you have a polymer, and you tell them whether it's a polymer of low concern or not. And that would help with enforcement, yeah. And then the notification would require certain minimum information, such as the name of the polymer, composition, tonnage band, molecular weight range, dispersity, the co-monomers, and degree of cross-linking. So that's what France wants. Germany wants the rules to take into account the degradation of the polymers into bioavailable fragments, and they want microscale polymers to be separately registered from normal polymers. Denmark wants special consideration for surface activity. Sweden also favors the same notification of status that France endorses, and they also want separate consideration of microscale polymers and as well as degradation, in the same way that Germany wants. Next slide. So anyway, that's quite a ambitious and aggressive program by the Commission, European Chemical Agency. What is industry doing? Well, they've set up a bunch of sector groups to look at different classes of polymers, try to come up with a kind of a coherent way of grouping the polymers to limit the number of polymers that need to be registered. And the reaction from the authorities so far is that there's no data to support these grouping proposals, which is probably largely true. So, this has been a problem throughout this entire process. There's very little data on polymers that at least people have shared with the European authorities. And so they're starting from the precautionary principle that, all polymers, unless they're polymers of low concern, are a problem and need to be registered. So where is the data? Well, companies have been registering polymers, new polymers, at least in the US, Canada. Well, US doesn't matter because you usually don't submit data with polymer PMN in the US. But certainly Canada's required data for many, many years, as have the Koreans, as have the Japanese, and so as have the Australians. So there's probably a universe of data on polymers, which could be used to support broad grouping, or at least may also be used to support a narrowing of the types of polymers that the Europeans should be concerned about. But that data is not being submitted. And I think that's, I think people are missing an opportunity here, because at the end of the day, it's been estimated this whole polymer registration regime is going to cost $3 billion, which is always only 10% of the actual true cost. So anyway, that's that. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Alex.
Thank you, Herb. So before heading to the two recent important ECHA Board of Appeal cases on the monomers, a few words on the monomer registration. So currently, polymers are not subject to registration, but their monomers and other reacted substances have to be registered. And so if this obligation is maintained in REACH after polymer registration is established, there is a risk actually that there will be a double registration. Imagine that you are importing a polymer from outside of the EU. Normally, you would have to register the polymer unless it's of low concern. But in addition, you would also have to register the monomer if it's not registered in the EU. So there will be double registration because of the same substance, because usually polymers of concern are often of concern because of their monomers. And we think actually that the monomer registration would lose its importance, its meaning after polymer registration is introduced. Because if polymer does not have to be registered because it is of low concern, that means that also any monomers in it, any unreacted monomers, are also of low concern. So their registration would not be necessary. And if polymer has to be registered because it is not of low concern, then any concern related to these polymers would be handled by the polymer registration. And from this perspective, again, monomer registration would not be necessary. So, so far in our knowledge, the Commission has not officially announced that they are envisaging deleting Article 6.3 from REACH, but we think that this should be repeated by, or this should be pushed by industry during various public consultations that will be held on this topic. So next slide, please. So let's look first at the very recent Board of Appeal case on monomer registration. So at the outset, the Board of Appeal stressed that there is a distinction between unreacted monomers that are placed on the market as such for any reason, not only to be incorporated in polymers, but for any other reason. And these are subject to the normal registration as any other substances, and reacted monomers incorporated in polymers, and these are subject to Article 6.3. So this Board of Appeal case is about Article 6.3 registration. So very importantly, under the second bullet point, the Board of Appeal held that after polymerization, a monomer ceases to exist as a substance on its own, as it is transformed into a new substance, the polymer. And therefore, no information on exposure to the monomer after polymerization is necessary under Article 14.1 REACH. In other words, the chemical safety report of monomer does not have to take into consideration any exposure after the polymerization. This has been, in our knowledge, interpretation of most of the registrants, but so far this interpretation has not been adopted by ECHA officially. So now it's official. Indeed, CSR does not have to have exposure assessment after polymerization. Now, in this specific case, the registrant went too far. Because the registrant invoked Annex 11 exposure adaptation. That means no studies are necessary for the monomer because since the life cycle ended before the polymers were imported, the exposure is zero. But here the Board of Appeal actually said that if you want to rely on Annex 11 adaptation, then you do have to have exposure assessment. You have to prove that there is no exposure and that there is basically safe use of the substance or of the monomer in unreacted form in the polymer. But as I said, this case is mainly important to confirm that CSR does not have to include exposure assessment after the polymerization. The second Board of Appeal, next slide, please. The second Board of Appeal is a bit older. It's on monomer evaluation or substance evaluation of monomers. So here the Board of Appeal held that indeed Article 2.9 of REACH exempts polymers from registration and evaluation. However, ECHA has the power to request information under Article 46, that is substance evaluation, on the presence of a monomer in polymers as an unreacted impurity after polymerization. So that basically means that normally not only full registration data is required for monomers in polymers, but they are also subject to substance evaluation. That means that ECHA can request basically any other data if justified, even beyond REACH registration requirements on monomers in polymers. However, this has a very important limitation, particularly if this information can only be provided by downstream users, it cannot be required by ECHA. And very often in substance evaluation, there are all types of exposure data and monitoring data, and this can typically be only provided by downstream users. So ECHA cannot request these. So this is for the two Board of Appeal cases. Herb, any final thoughts? I think you were already quite exhaustive.
Yeah, but, I think I already talked about the polymers requiring registration. I think it's important to pay attention to that all because it's can happen the next couple of years, and European industry is working hard to try to resolve some of these things. But to the extent there is U.S. trade associations that can be of assistance, I would suggest that you do, talk to your European counterparts. I think there's a great need for data. I mean, I think data could resolve a lot of these things. I mean, I've been involved in my career with a lot of these registrations of new polymers. Generally, innocuous. Once you actually get the data together, they're innocuous. So, but I don't think the Europeans are looking at it that way. They're looking at, that they're guilty unless proven innocent. And so, anyway, next slide, please. That's my final thoughts. Next slide. So the next Reach 3030, we do these every 60 days. And so we're going to have it on September 15th. And, it's very hard to pick a topic because there's just so many things going on in Europe and they're all largely bad news. It's hard to pick a topic. So we decided on polymers, but I don't know what we're going to do in September, but, there's just so many different things going on in Europe. And then, the US used to be quite quiet during the Trump administration, but I think now we're sort of equaling what's going on in Europe. So our next task of 3030 is going to be on August 18th. Next slide, please. So anyway, thank you for participating. We had about 100 participants. I'm Herbert Stryker, and I was joined by my colleague, Alesh Baltel, and we'll see you again in mid-September. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.